there, everybody, and welcome to your first lecture for Anatomy 2 for this summer. This is going to be a pretty brief one. It's just going over fluid compartments and how fluid moves from one part of your body to another and the balance that is supposed to be in place for the movement of the water between, say, your blood, the interstitial fluid that fills the tissues, the intracellular fluid that is inside your cells, and then back out of the cells from the interstitial fluid into the lymph, and then that would end up back into the blood. So if we're thinking of, say, a drop of water, and you drink this drop of water and it gets into your digestive tract and it's absorbed through your intestinal epithelium into your blood, then that one drop of water is in the blood. It will move possibly from the capillary, which is where we have all exchange between the blood and the tissues, is at the capillaries, which we'll see in a later unit in a lot more detail. But just imagine this one drop of water moving out of the capillary, so out of the blood, and it goes into the interstitial fluid. From there, it might end up going into the cell. It might not. Either way, if it does go into the cell, it'll probably end up moving back out again at some point, so it'll be in the interstitial fluid. And then it might go back into the blood to be reabsorbed into the capillary, or it could go into the lymph in a lymphatic vessel, which will be filtered through lymph nodes for immunological purposes, which we'll also learn about in the later topics. But eventually, that lymph is going to get put back into the bloodstream, and then that drop of water is back in the blood. And that will continue. That water will continue circulating throughout these compartments until it is excreted either through the intestine, so going back into the colon and being excreted that way, or through the kidneys, where we have blood being filtered, forming urine, which is composed mostly of water and some other substances. So there's constant movement between these compartments because each compartment is separated only by a semi-permeable membrane. So in the case of the capillary separating the blood from the interstitial fluid, we have just the endothelial cells, which are the cells that surround capillaries. They're just simple squamous epithelial cells, really thin. So we have their cell membranes and a basement membrane, and that's it. So water can pass really easily from the blood into the interstitial fluid. Between the interstitial fluid and the cell itself, so the fluid inside the cell, the cytoplasm or the intracellular fluid, there's just the cell membrane. Again, water passes really easily. And then the same idea over here on the other side between the interstitial fluid and the lymphatic vessels. It's just a simple semi-permeable membrane separating what's inside the lymphatic vessel, which would be lymph, and the interstitial fluid. So water has no trouble going from one compartment to the other. So the compartments then, we have our intracellular fluid, and that is just the cytoplasm. That is just what is inside the cell. So the ICF, it can be abbreviated as. And this is actually where most of your body water is going to be found. About 2/3 of your total body water is found here. And you already know a bit about what's in intracellular fluid as compared to what's outside of the cell. When you think back to AMP1 and when you're learning about the electrochemical gradients of ions and neurons especially, where you have in the intracellular fluid, oops, I got these mixed up here. This should be, this is extracellular fluid. This is the intracellular fluid. So in the intracellular fluid, you have a lot of potassium. You know that from neurons. Inside the neurons, you would have a lot of potassium. So that's true for all cells. You'll have more magnesium inside the cell than outside the cell, and you'll have more phosphate inside the cell than outside the cell. So this goes down here. Now, extracellular fluid, on the other hand, that's anything that's outside of the cell. So it would be the blood, it would be the interstitial fluid, it would be the lymph, it would be also other miscellaneous places where you have fluid, like your cerebrospinal fluid, or the aqueous humor, or the vitreous humor in your eye, or the perilymph and endolymph in your ear, those sorts of places. Now, usually we tend to think of, having a lot of extracellular fluid, but it's not really the case. There's only about a third of our total body water is in the extracellular fluid. And even then, in that case, most of it is in the interstitial fluid. So if you think about, the components of what's going on in the extracellular fluid, where you have, lots of sodium, chlorine, calcium, which you already should know from AP1. We also have something called bicarbonate, which we're going to see a lot of with acid-base balance. All of these things have a lot to do with which way water moves across one compartment to another, so across the cell membrane. So we know that sodium, say, is very attractive to water because it's what we would call an electrolyte. And electrolytes just attract water. So, if you were to become very salty out here, you're going to affect the water movement between the compartments. So water would be being pulled out in that case if we put a lot of salt out here. Or if we were to dilute this very much, so there, say, wasn't a lot of salts outside of the cell anymore, it was just very diluted, then water would end up going into the cell. So we can really affect what's happening in each cell when we affect what's happening in the extracellular fluid in general, but specifically the interstitial fluid. Okay, so normally we would want our compartments to be in what's called osmotic equilibrium, where we have the same amount of water leaving the cell as we have water going into the cell. So it's in a nice balance. We have more sodium outside the cell. We have more potassium inside the cell. There's also proteins inside the cell. Other electrolytes are also in various places, and they'll all be contributing to the osmotic pressures that cause water to move either in or out of the cell. So normally, hopefully, we have a situation where we're not pulling excessive amounts of water out of your cells and we're not pushing excessive amounts of water into the cells. Because if we're to move from this balance, then we will affect how much water is moving in and out of the cells, and that can be bad for the cells. So let's say we make the extracellular fluid hypertonic. This would be the situation I was mentioning before. If we were to put a ton of salt, say, just use sodium, that's the easiest way to make it hypertonic, is to put a lot of salt outside the cell. So what that does then is it pulls the water out of the cell. So the cells are going to end up shrinking. They can shrivel up and actually die, and that's called cell crenation. This is because we've messed up the balance. We've changed it away from osmotic equilibrium. We have more concentrated electrolytes, less of a volume of water outside the cell, so the water's going to want to move out of the cell. So that's not good if we're shrinking our cells and killing them through crenation. That's obviously not good. Now, how would you become hypertonic in your extracellular fluid? If you're dehydrated, say, you haven't added any extra salt to your interstitial fluid per se, but you lost water. You don't have enough water to dilute it, so the concentration goes up. That's one way to become hypertonic. To ingest a lot of sodium is another very easy way of becoming hypertonic. If you eat a lot of processed foods, if you look at the sodium content in those processed foods, you'll see that there is usually a lot of sodium. So if you eat a lot of those things, you can become hypertonic. Now, the opposite situation would be if you were to have your extracellular fluid become hypotonic. In this case, it's just exactly the opposite. You would have a lot of water out here, so your electrolytes like sodium and things like that are going to be more dilute. So you're going to change the balance of water. Instead of pulling water out, now you're going to be pushing water into the cell. The cell can swell and eventually explode, and that's called lysis. And again, that's not good. You don't want to explode your cells. So this can become detrimental to the cells as well, in the opposite kind of way. So how would you become hypotonic in your extracellular fluid? Drinking a lot of water. So lots and lots of water. Your kidneys are very good at handling water that you're drinking trying to keep you in osmotic equilibrium, so preventing either one of these. But if you were to drink a lot of water in a very short amount of time, you could end up with something called water intoxication, which is just this. Never eating sodium. So if you somehow manage to avoid eating salt at all, you can become hypotonic also. Okay. Also, kidney malfunction could cause either one of these situations to happen. If your kidneys aren't excreting sodium, or if they are excreting water too fast, that can cause problems either way. Okay, so now let's look at our electrolytes a little bit more and how it relates to what's going on with your cells, not just in terms of water balance, but also in terms of how active your cells are, or how excitable they are. And here we're thinking more in terms of the excitable sorts of cells like neurons and muscle cells like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, cells that can have action potentials. So we're going to look at each of 3 different ions. We're going to look at sodium, we'll look at potassium, and we'll look at calcium. And here you should remember from ANP1 the electrochemical gradients of each of those ions in order for this to make sense. So I'll review it really briefly, but if you don't remember very well, if you're not following along, just make sure that you go back over your ANP1 notes so that you remember those electrochemical gradients just for these 3. So we know that sodium has an electrochemical gradient to go into a cell almost pretty much all the time. So when you have a normal osmotic balance and you have normal sodium levels, sodium still wants to go into the cell, and that's good. That's how you cause depolarization of the cell. So this is outside the cell, this is inside the cell. These double lines are the cell membrane. And when you move sodium inside the cell, that causes the cell to have an action potential. We know that potassium is in a higher concentration inside the cell, and that it has an electrochemical gradient to move outside the cell. And not always that when we're recovering from, say, an action potential, the outward movement of potassium will stop. But typically, when a cell is at rest, and the way that we recover from having an action potential is to move potassium out of the cell. It helps to repolarize the cell because we're taking that positive ion and putting it outside. So allowing potassium to leave the cell helps you to recover from your action potential, helps you become negative inside the cell again, helps you relax the cell after an action potential. We're allowing sodium to go into the cell during an action potential, or to cause an action potential, is going to tend to excite the cell. So let's just focus on these 2 for now. We'll get to calcium next. So let's say we are hypernatremic. That means that you have too much sodium. Hyper means too much. Natremia is referring to sodium, which is why the chemical symbol for sodium is Na. The Latin word for it is natrium. But anyway, so we have too much sodium. So this could be just like what we went over before. Maybe you're dehydrated, so you just don't have a lot of water to dilute the sodium. Maybe you've ingested a lot of sodium, something like that. So what we've done here, we put so much more sodium out here that now sodium really wants to go into the cell. We've really increased the electrochemical gradient for sodium to move into the cell. And that makes it easier for the cells to have action potentials. It makes them hyper excitable. So they start having action potentials more and more often. What this would do is it would cause your neurons to fire action potentials too much. So your brain would feel kind of anxious, agitated. Your heart rate, that's a, cardiac muscle is an excitable cell, so your heart rate would go up. Maybe even end up with some flutters, palpitations of the heart. Just overall jittery, like just imagine drinking way too much caffeine, how you feel. That would be the hypernatremic feeling. On top of that, being hypernatremic also messes with your osmotic balance, which we kind of hinted at a couple minutes ago, where we're talking about if you have a lot of sodium, it's a good way, it's an easy way to become hypertonic. So if you're hypertonic, then water is going to be moving out of the cell, being pulled out of the cell by the sodium, and that is going to cause cell crenation. So not good on many levels. This is why, for example, they say never drink ocean water. It's very salty. And let's say you're like, stranded on a boat in the middle of the ocean and all you have around you, have all this water, you're really thirsty. But if you drink it, it's going to kill you really quickly because you'll become hypernatremic and hypertonic by drinking the ocean water. I don't mean like if you're just swimming in the ocean and a wave hits you in the face and you swallow a little bit. That's not going to cause you to be hypernatremic. It just tastes nasty. But if you were to just drink a whole lot of it, that could cause that problem. Now for hyperkalemia, this is a potassium imbalance. So kalemia, so the reason why the chemical symbol for potassium is K is because kalium is the chemical name for potassium in Latin. So in hyperkalemia, you have too much potassium outside of the cell. And remember, normally you just have potassium inside the cell in larger quantity, but in the case of hyperkalemia, you have too much potassium outside the cell, which is not normal. This could be caused by ingesting a lot of potassium, which would be sort of difficult to do. Again, the kidneys are very good at getting rid of these ions when you have too many of them, but if, say, you were having a kidney malfunction, that could cause hyperkalemia. So remember that in order for our cells to repolarize after an action potential, we have to have potassium leave the cell. So if we have added a lot of potassium outside of the cell, potassium's not going to want to leave the cell anymore. We've decreased the electrochemical gradient for potassium to leave the cell. So the cells aren't going to be able to repolarize. They can't recover from having an action potential. They're just going to be stuck being depolarized. So that makes them hyperexcitable. Also, all this potassium out here is going to affect the sodium. That is just, let's just say we have a normal amount of sodium outside the cell in this case. But this is a positive ion. Sodium is also a positive ion. That's not going to work very well with sodium being out here with all this positive potassium too. It's just going to make sodium need to go into the cell that much more. So it's going to increase the electrochemical gradient for sodium to go in, or not the electrochemical gradient, just the electrical gradient, because it's just dealing with a charge for sodium to go into the cell. And that will help to make the cells hyperexcitable. So if you're hypernatremic or hyperkalemic, you're going to have super excitable cells, jittery, anxious, your heart will be beating too fast, all sorts of things. Now for calcium. With calcium, it's not so much looking at the electrochemical gradients of things, although the electrochemical gradient for calcium is typically to move into a cell, and that would tend to excite cells like cardiac muscle or smooth muscle if you move calcium into them. But what we're thinking of most importantly when we think of calcium is that having calcium or not having calcium is going to affect the threshold of your voltage-gated channels. And remember that your threshold for your voltage-gated channels is the charge that causes them to open, which allows you to have an action potential. So if you make the threshold higher for the voltage-gated channels, it makes it harder to open them. It makes it harder to reach that threshold, so you wouldn't have as many action potentials. If you lower the threshold for your voltage-gated channels, it makes it a lot easier to have your action potentials. So they would become hyperexcitable. So what calcium does, the presence of calcium, so having a lot of calcium would increase the threshold for your voltage-gated channels, but I've put here hypocalcemia, so not having enough calcium. And what that does is it decreases that threshold for your voltage-gated channels, so it makes it really low. So it's really easy to open those voltage-gated channels and have an action potential. And why I put that there this way, so where we have too much sodium, too much potassium, not enough calcium, is that all three of those things cause you to be hyperexcitable. So jittery, anxious, heart rate going too fast. Now the opposite situation would be exactly opposite. So if we were hyponatremic, hypokalemic, or hypercalcemic, these would cause the opposite effect. These would cause under excitation of cells. So it would be harder to stimulate the cells. And it would just be the exact opposite situation of what we have here. Now, there is a video for you to watch and some thought questions. This is your first assignment. It's the hyponatremia video and thought questions. The questions are posted. There's also a quiz that will be posted that are just the questions. But it's so that Blackboard, it's just so that you can submit them on Blackboard, have Blackboard grade them for me. So that makes it easier for you because it'll be multiple choice. It makes it easier for me because Blackboard grades it for me. This video, I will tell you, it is pretty complex. It's a little bit of a thinker. So, you know, if you're finding yourself confused a bit by the video, don't be alarmed by that. It is a difficult video. It's kind of fun, though, to try to think of it in more of a medical sort of way, which is where this video is going. So more of something that you'll apply in your future careers, maybe. So it's pretty interesting, but it is challenging, so don't be frustrated by it. Just do your best with the questions, and I'll post the answers after everyone's turned them in. So make sure that you watch that video and do those questions. It'll be a quiz on Blackboard, but you can prepare because you'll have the questions written out before as you watch that video. And it just deals with essentially what we were doing with, there's the cell membrane, here's outside the cell, here's inside the cell. They draw it sideways, though, so they have inside the cell, and over on one side, and they have outside the cell, and then they have like water balance, so it goes up or it goes down, so how much water is in the extracellular fluid versus how much water is in the intracellular fluid, going up or going down. So they're just showing water moving that way. So watch that video. This is it for our fluid compartments section, and our next section will be acid-base balance. So I'll see you there.